Hello and welcome. This is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I will be doing an ultra colorful watercolor painting of a dog. I started out by drawing the picture of the dog, and then I came in with fine line masking fluid to help block in the areas of the paper that I wanted to keep ultra white. Masking fluid just creates a barrier between the paint and the paper so that the paint doesn't penetrate or get those areas dirty. Once the masking fluid dried, I wet the paper on the back of the dog and then started coming in with orange and yellow paints to really help it flow. I pre-wet the paper and I also sprayed it with a spray bottle once the paints were down to really get the paints flowing and moving. You can see that the paper looks a little different now. That is because I let the paper dry completely before coming in with this next layer of paint, which is a cadmium red color. And you can see the paint's just really flowing all over the paper. And I came in with another red and just really building up that area and just letting it flow. I'm tilting my board to help it flow. I then let it dry completely. And now I'm going in with more masking fluid to start blocking in some of the highlights on the fur. This is a really easy way to be able to protect those areas while doing really wet washes over the top, because the masking fluid won't pill up the paint that's underneath it. It just keeps paint from penetrating. I then started working on the face. I made sure that the red and orange area was completely dry and the masking fluid was completely dry before I started in on it. This will help keep the paints more easily controlled. When you're doing a really wet painting like this, where you're doing lots of layers and you're working with really wet paint, especially in the early stages, it's important that you can control that paint. And one of the ways I found is to make sure that the layers underneath it are completely dry. That way the paint won't feather and blend into spots that I don't want it to. Other ways to help control your paints is by pre-wetting the paper. That will make sure that it only spreads to the areas that you want it to go. You can also use a dry paintbrush to absorb puddles that might not be where you want them to be, or there's just too much water and you'll get some weird drying effects. A clean rag is also great. You'll see me using that a lot. And tilting your board can also help the paint flow to the areas that you want it to flow to, especially if there's a whole bunch. So those are just some things I do to help me control the paint where I want it. You can see I just dabbed up the paint right there because there was just too big of a puddle. So try experimenting with different ways to control your paints and see what works best for you and in what situations they work best. I've painted so much that lots of times I don't even think about it. It's just comes second nature to me on what I need to do to a picture. And that's just from practicing, and that's from practicing a lot. And so I encourage you to practice and try new techniques and kind of push yourself out of your comfort zone so that you can really get comfortable with the medium and it just becomes fun and you don't have to work as hard to know what to do. Another thing I found that is really helpful with these ultra colorful watercolor paintings is to plan ahead what you're going to do. Now, this is good advice before starting any pictures, to kind of have an idea of what you're going to do, especially with watercolor because it is an unforgiving medium. It's harder to fix your mistakes. But with these ultra colorful ones, since you're going to be using all different kinds of crazy colors and they're going to interact in different ways, it's good to have an idea of how you want them to flow before you start. So when I am planning one out, I'll usually mentally kind of think about how I want this picture to look, how I want the colors to flow into each other, what things I need to stand out, what things need to recede, and how I'm going to use color to help with that. For this particular piece, the client wanted it ultra bright, and so I made sure I didn't put too many complementary colors right next to each other. Now, complementary colors on the color wheel are colors that are opposite, and when you mix them, they turn to brown. So red and green are opposite, blue and orange are opposite, yellow and purple are opposite. And so to help keep these colors bright as they mix on the paper, I don't want to have complementary colors overlapping too much. Now, There's been times where I have wanted complementary colors overlapping in specific areas, even in colorful pictures like this, because I need a shadow to darken up an area, or I need something to recede visually so that something else can pop out. And so playing with the brightness can help with that. So where you layer your colors is really important. If you're having a hard time kind of mentally planning it out, you can just sketch it out and kind of color it in. I do it on complicated ones on my iPad, but I've done it just quick sketches or tiny thumbnail watercolor paintings to just lay out the colors and get a game plan before I go in on my nice watercolor paper that I don't want to ruin. So just something to keep in mind in how you want the colors to blend. So at this point, I've got a base layer pretty much all over the entire dog. And I did it in the same manner that we talked about with the red, yellow, and orange area. And so I just continued that process throughout the whole thing. And with editing, you haven't really seen me add more layers of masking fluid, but I have been adding more layers of masking fluid to each area as I did the base layer. So I did a nice light, bright area of blue, and then I let it dry and added masking fluid before I moved on to the areas next to it. That way I can protect those nice light blue areas before they get more paint over the top. I now am coming in with Brusho, which is a powdered watercolor, and I didn't use a lot of it in this painting. It was mostly just because I wanted to loosen up a little bit, have some fun gradients, and kind of push myself to go with the flow of the paint, pun intended. For the most part, I've been using Dr. Ph Martins Hydrus watercolors for this piece. This is a type of paint I've used a ton on my channel, and I've even reviewed, and I'm not sponsored by them at all. I just really love their products. I use their inks a lot. I've used their Radiant watercolors, but by far my favorite product they make is their Hydrus watercolors. These watercolors are a liquid watercolor. They come in a little bottle and they have a little dropper that you drop out the pigment with. They're pigment based. They're not ink based like the Radiant watercolors. And so these are light fast. If you let them sit for a long time without using them, you can sometimes see the pigment start to settle at the bottom and you just have to shake it up. They're very translucent. They're not opaque like sometimes tube watercolors can be. And they are very staining, which is good or bad depending on your style of painting. When I'm doing ultra colorful pieces like this, I find it very beneficial to use staining paints, whether I'm using Hydrus watercolors or my M. Graham watercolors or whatever I'm using. The more staining the color, the easier it is because they don't have a tendency to lift off when layers of paint go over the top. Now I can scrub it and I can lighten them, but it does help keep the paint in place where I want it to be, which is one of the challenges of watercolor. I'm also working on Arch's watercolor paper, which can take a lot of layers and scrubbing and all kinds of things to it, which makes it easier to work in this style. That said, use whatever watercolor paper and paints you have. You might have to work a little bit differently than I do to make them work for you, but you can absolutely do colorful watercolor paintings like this with what you have. You might have to do more layers of paint to get them really color saturated. You might have to add more water to your paints and really mix them up so they flow easier. You might have to work more concisely and not do quite as many layers because your paper can't handle as many layers. Like Strathmore 400 paper is a great beginner paper, but it doesn't take as many layers as Arch's. So you have to be more determined and concise where you put your paints. You can't just mess around with your paper and do lots of layers over the top. So just keep that in mind, but don't let you not having a material or a medium exactly like mine hold you back from creating. You could do this in acrylic. You might have to change your approach, but you could paint something like this super easily in acrylic or with pencils or whatever. Take the techniques that you can learn from these tutorials and then apply them to whatever medium you work in or whatever materials you have to work with. So at this stage in the painting, I'm really starting to focus on the shadow areas and what areas need to be darkened up. Now, I'm not going full to the darkest spot yet. I'm building up to it, but I am starting to darken up areas, see what needs to be in shadow more, and adding the darker colors to that to create the shadow effect to them. Because the picture looks really flat without the shadows. There's no contrast really within the look of the dog, except for the eyes that aren't even painted yet. And it can be really discouraging when you're at this stage in the painting process where your picture kind of looks like a hot mess. Everything looks flat. It doesn't look very good. And I know a lot of beginners just kind of quit and give up. I know I did in the past. But the most important thing is to keep going and just see what needs to be done. Now, when you're doing really crazy colorful pictures like this, it's really easy to get distracted by what the colors and not knowing kind of what to do yet. And you don't know where to put things, or you're kind of confused by your reference photo because it's not color matching your picture. And I have found the best thing I can do when I'm struggling with that is to make my reference picture black and white, if possible. So I will usually have it on my computer or my iPad or my phone, whatever I'm working off of. I found it's best if my reference photo is black and white, because then I can just see the contrast. I can see the values, I can see what's light and what's dark, and I'm not distracted by the colors that are going on in the picture. And then if I'm struggling with the painting and I don't know what needs to be adjusted or corrected, I will quickly take a picture of it and turn that picture black and white, and then I can see what needs to be darkened and lightened and see how it compares to my reference photo. So if you're getting kind of lost and you don't know what to do next, I suggest taking a picture. If you can't take a photo, taking a few steps back from it and kind of squinting at the picture will help you see what needs to be adjusted, because that flattens out how the picture looks with your eyes, and you can really see what things contrast and what things just kind of meld together. So I've just started blocking in some areas around the nose in this picture right now, and I've started blocking in the ears, and you can really see I'm really starting to amp up the dark colors. I'm keeping it a dark navy blue and purple tones around the face because those are the colors there. And then to create shadows in other areas, I'll do a separate mix for the shadow colors. Once the orangey brown color in the eyes dried, I started coming in with a more dark brown color. I just mixed it using complementary colors. I think I did this as a purpley blue and orange mix, and I had it lean more towards the orange and red side of it. But that way I can block in the eyes. I like to keep the eyes realistic. I think I talked about that in my lion painting, but I found that it helps keep the picture centered and it keeps the eyes the main focus, even though there's so much color and craziness going on around them. So I'm just going in and doing some more detail work, starting to do more refining shadows, and I'm making sure that my strokes are going in the direction of the fur or in the shape of whatever it is I'm trying to paint. So I'm making my brush strokes fit with the nose and be more smooth, since the nose isn't furry, but I want the hair or fur of the dog to be directional, and so I'm making sure my brush strokes fit that. If they're by the face, those strokes are going to be shorter and they're going to be more straight because it's not as curly on the snout, and they're not as long, versus the ears or the back of the dog where the hair's longer and has a little bit more curl or wave to it. So make sure that your brush strokes are matching what you're trying to paint, and use your brush strokes to help form the shape of the object. So I'm trying to make the hair look like it's going up over the bones of the dog, up around onto its forehead, or around its eyes, or around its I can't even speak, its snout, And so I want the fur to look like it's going in the direction. And you'll really want to look at your reference photo and other pictures of dogs possibly to kind of see how it goes and keep the length correct to fit that. It's really important when you're building these layers that every layer is taken seriously. There might be more paint that goes over the top of this, but to really get the feeling of fur and all of that, you want your layers to work together. You don't want to have to try and cover a mistake or have it fight against what you're trying to achieve. So even though there's still a lot of layers of paint that might go over what you're doing, be aware of what it is, especially since watercolor is a translucent medium. And so usually some of those bottom layers are going to shine through. And now I am darkening up the picture even more. I've been gradually building up in the areas with darker versions or stronger concentrations of the colors in those areas. So it was very dark blue in the blue areas, dark red in those areas. And now to amp up that concentration even more, I'm mixing a little bit of black or complementary colors to really darken them up and create that contrast. And it's really paying off that gradual buildup because it's really making this picture pop and having a lot of texture or the visual appearance of texture because there's so many different values and layers of color built up that it's looking a lot like fur, and it will continue to become more and more like that as the picture progresses. So don't be afraid to take your time, take as many layers as you need, and see what you can create. One exercise you can do to help you learn how to compare your reference photo to what you're painting and to see how far you can push and layer your watercolors is by picking a simple item or a picture of something that's really simple, like a leaf or a feather or something like that, and just doing really light layers of color and just building it up and looking at your reference photo and see how realistic you can do it. And doing that fairly regularly can really help you learn to analyze and compare your reference photo to your painting and see what needs to be tweaked. And it can help you develop the skill of working really lightly and how to build your layers up to help create a form and a shape that's realistic, and to give the impression of fur if you're practicing something that's like a little animal, or if a smooth texture, like if you're practicing painting a piece of marble that's really smooth and doing the details with that. The more you practice simple things like that, even in your sketchbook, will really help you when you create a full-size painting. So once I felt like I had pushed the darks dark enough at that point, I removed the masking fluid, and then I could compare my highlights to my shadows and can see exactly what needs to be tweaked. And I decided that I needed a little bit more red, and so I just did light washes of red over top of those highlights, those highlighted areas I had preserved. And I started being able to do more fine detail because I didn't have masking fluid blocking off areas around the eyes and the nose. And so I'm just really starting this fine tuning of the picture. I'm probably 99% done at this point and just doing the last tweaks. This is also a great time to kind of take a step back on your picture and go do something else and then come back to it later. And then you'll be able to really see what needs to be adjusted. It's also this late into the picture when I start doing more black. I try not to keep anything too black. I like to mix it with other colors, but this is where I'm using the strongest concentration, and I'm just using it for the areas I need to pop. So details around the eyes and around the nose where I really want the focus of the picture to be drawn to. That's also where I keep the brightest highlights. You can see that the eyes have the brightest amount of white. And we are on the final stretch of this picture. At this stage of the painting, I was taking a lot of breaks. I was kind of tilting it up and against my wall and kind of taking a step back to see what was really blending in what clumps of fur or hair needed to have a little bit more contrast. And I was also going really slowly with those final details that will really make this pop. So like the details around the eye with the little strands of hair that are poking out, and just those little things, and being really careful with them to make them precise and exactly how I need them to be, are going to really help this pop. When you're in these final stages, take your time. Don't rush it. I know it's really exciting because you're almost done, but just take your time. Lots of times when I'm about 99% done, I put it to the side and then I come back to it the next day or the next week and kind of see what needs to be tweaked. Because then things that my brain wasn't noticing in the moment pick up on them more easily, and I'm better able to see what needs to be adjusted. And as I finish up the final details on this picture, I just want to thank you so much for your support on this channel and for liking my videos and watching them and commenting and all of that stuff. It really helps my channel grow, and doing YouTube videos and teaching videos wasn't really something I originally planned doing as an artist. It just kind of came about organically, and it's been so fun to see what you guys create based off of what I've taught you. I often get tagged on Instagram, or people in my community will tell me what they created or what their kids created because they saw what I was doing on the videos, and it just really means a lot to me. So thank you so much, and I hope this video helps you in your path to learning watercolors. Have a great day. Bye.